200 birds, all of them wrong in some way, and she counted them out one by one into the back of a borrowed stock trailer, while 3 men leaned on the loading rail and made a study of laughing at her. Not big laughing, the mean kind that comes out quiet through the nose, the kind that saves itself so it can be repeated later at the feed store with the details sharpened. The geese were thin, their necks were long, and the feathers along their breasts had a molted, patchy look, and more than a few of them limped where the previous owner had kept them on wire too long. She had paid $12 a head for the lot when the man selling them had been ready to let them go for 2, and that was the part the watching men could not get over. $12 for a goose that looked like it had been assembled out of leftovers. Her name was Wren Callahan, 23 years old, and she loaded them without hurrying, which somehow annoyed the men more than if she had struggled. She would reach into the crate, take a bird by the base of the wings the way you were supposed to, and almost nobody bothers to, set it down inside the trailer, and reach for the next. 60, 61. She kept the tally in her head and also in a small water-stained notebook she pulled from her jacket pocket between crates, licking the pencil tip, writing something, sliding it back. One of the men, a broad fellow named Del Marchetti, who ran 400 acres of corn out past the Sable Fork crossing, finally said it loud enough to be meant. He said a scrawny goose eats the same as a fat one and lays half as much, and you have bought yourself 200 mouths and no dinner. The other 2 grinned at the ground. Wren set another bird down. 62, she said to no one, and reached for the next. If you have ever had somebody look at what you were holding and tell you it wasn't worth the trouble, do me a small favor before this goes any further. Tap the like button so this story gets carried a little farther down the road, and leave a comment telling me what town you're watching from, because I read them and I like knowing where these stories land. Now let me take you back and show you how a girl with 200 bad-looking geese ended up being the only person in that whole valley with anything left standing. She had come back to the valley in the fall of the year before, which nobody expected, least of all her. The place she came back to sat at the dead end of Harlow Bottoms Road, a lane that ran 3 miles off the county highway and then simply gave up, and at the end of it was the farm her great-uncle Ambrose Teague had worked for 51 years, and then, in the manner of stubborn old men, died on, out in the pasture, with a fence tool in his hand and a job half finished. He had left the place to Wren for reasons the family argued about at the funeral and never settled. She was his sister's granddaughter, and she had spent childhood summers there, and she was the only one of the whole scattered clan who had ever once, unprompted, called the farm beautiful. Ambrose had heard her say it when she was 9. He had written it down. That was the kind of man he was. He wrote things down. The farm was not, by any measure the county respected, worth coming back for. 240 acres, most of it low ground that flooded in a wet spring and cracked in a dry August. The soil in the bottoms was heavy and cold and slow to warm, and every farmer who had ever leased a piece of it had cursed it and let the lease lapse. The high ground was thin and stony. There was a barn with a swayed spine, a farmhouse that needed a roof more than it needed a coat of paint, and a spring-fed pond down in the willows that never went dry, which was the one thing anybody would say a kind word about. Ambrose had run cattle and a little hay, and had never once gotten rich, and when he died, the men who came to the estate auction to bid on his equipment shook their heads over the ground itself and agreed it was a shame, meaning it was a shame the land was no good. Wren had been living 3 states away, working the counter at a garden center and sleeping in a room she rented from a woman who watched television through the wall until 2 in the morning. She was not running from anything dramatic. She simply woke up one day with the certainty that she was spending her life in a place she felt nothing for. And when the letter came from the lawyer in the county seat telling her the farm was hers if she wanted the burden of it, she gave 2 weeks' notice the same afternoon. Her mother told her it was a mistake. Her mother said the land wasn't worth the taxes on it, and that Ambrose had been a peculiar old man who never should have been trusted to write a will. Wren listened to all of it and drove out anyway, arriving at the end of Harlow Bottoms Road with everything she owned in the bed of a truck that burned oil. and she stood in the yard for a long while just looking at the place before she carried a single box inside. That was a thing she did. She looked at things a long time before she touched them. The only other person who lived within shouting distance was Ambrose's widowed sister-in-law, Wren's great-aunt Odessa Teague, who was 81 and had a house a half-mile up the road and a way of appearing in Wren's yard without seeming to have walked there. Odessa had buried 2 husbands and outlived most of her own children, and she wore men's canvas coveralls and rubber boots every single day, not out of poverty, but because she had decided a long time ago that she was past caring what a thing looked like and cared only whether it worked. She had earned the right to dress that way, and she knew it. She spoke about as often as a fence post, and when she did speak, it landed on you and stayed. In those first weeks, she came down and watched Wren try to make sense of the place, and she did not offer much beyond the occasional flat correction, such as when Wren started to plant a fall garden in the low ground, and Odessa said, without heat, that anything she put there before May would rot, and walked off before Wren could ask why. It was Odessa, though, who set the whole thing in motion, and she did it almost by accident, the way the important things in that valley always seem to happen. Wren had been going through Ambrose's papers, which filled 2 filing cabinets and a steamer trunk and were organized by a logic only he had ever understood, when she found the ledgers. Decades of them, rainfall by the week, the date of the first frost every single year going back to before she was born, which fields flooded and how deep and how long the water stood. And tucked among the weather notes, in the back of a ledger from a year when Wren had not yet been born, a single underlined line that she read 3 times before she understood it was not about the weather at all. The cold comes up the bottoms first, and it comes late, Ambrose had written. And then, underlined twice, the frost that kills the valley skips the low ground by a week every year, and nobody plants there to find out. She sat on the barn floor with that ledger open in her lap for the better part of an hour, and she did not yet know what it meant, only that it meant something, and that it was the kind of thing a man writes down when he has watched a place his whole life, and nobody has ever once asked him what he saw. She asked Odessa about it. She carried the ledger up the road and found the old woman shelling beans on her porch, and she read the line aloud and asked what Ambrose had meant. Odessa did not stop shelling beans. She said Ambrose had been trying to tell people that for 40 years, and people had decided he was simple because he lived alone and talked to his cattle, and that the truth of it was the cold air off the ridge slid down over the high ground and settled and killed everything up there, while the bottoms, being lower and holding the warmth off the spring-fed water and the wet earth, stayed a few degrees kinder right through the first hard frosts of fall. The bottoms froze last, Odessa said, every year. She had watched it herself for 60 years. Then she said the thing that Wren would come back to over and over in the months ahead. She said, "Worth isn't loud. It just waits for the right cold." And she went on shelling beans as though she had said nothing at all, and Wren stood there holding the ledger and feeling something turn over in her chest like ground under a plow. Now a girl who found out her worthless bottoms held their warmth a week longer than every other field in the valley might have done the sensible thing and planted a late crop, tried to squeeze one more cutting or one more harvest out of the calendar, and there would have been a story in that too. But Wren did not have the money to plant much of anything, and the equipment at the auction had all been sold to pay the lawyer, and she had, by the end of that first winter, almost nothing but the land and the ledgers, and a great-aunt who dispensed wisdom at the rate of about 1 sentence a week. What she had instead was time, and the habit of watching, and she spent that whole first spring and summer just learning the place, walking the bottoms in the early mornings, noting where the water stood, where the frost pocket sat on the high ground on the cold mornings, keeping her own notebook the way Ambrose had kept his, until she understood in her body what the ledgers had only told her in words. And somewhere in there, standing at the pond in the willows watching a pair of wild geese that had set down to rest on their way south, she started to think about geese, though she could not yet have told you why. The idea came together slowly, the way a thing does when nobody is pushing it. Wren had noticed that the low ground, which flooded and cracked and refused every ordinary crop, grew grass and forbs and sedges in a wild abundance that nothing would eat, because cattle bogged down in the wet and sheep took sick on it, and it was, in the county's judgment, useless pasture. But geese did not bog down. Geese thrived in exactly the wet, cold, marshy ground that ruined everything else, and they would graze that useless abundance and turn it into meat and eggs and down, and they would do it on land that owed nobody anything. She read every scrap she could find about it, driving 40 minutes to the county library and sitting with old agricultural bulletins from a time when a farmer keeping a flock of grazing geese was as ordinary as keeping chickens, before the whole country decided that anything worth doing had to be done 1,000 acres at a time. She learned that geese had once weeded cotton and strawberry fields across the whole South, that they had been walked to market in droves down actual roads, that a good grazing goose cost almost nothing to keep because it fed itself off ground that grew feed for free. And she learned that the birds had fallen out of favor for no better reason than that they did not scale, that you could not cram them into a building the way you could a chicken, that they needed grass and water and room, all the things her worthless bottoms had in ruinous excess. She looked at that for a long time. Then she started saving to buy geese. The lot of 200 came available in the early spring of the second year, when a man over in the next county who had tried and failed to run geese in confinement gave up and put them up for sale. And they were, as everyone at the loading rail could plainly see, in rough shape, thin and molted and footsore from a life on wire. Del Marchetti and his 2 companions had come to that sale to buy hay equipment and had stayed to watch the girl from Harlow Bottoms make what they considered the single stupidest purchase they had witnessed in years. She paid too much because she wanted the whole lot and the seller knew it, and she loaded them without hurrying while Del offered his opinion about mouths and dinners, and when she had all 200 counted into the trailer, she closed the gate and latched it and turned around and looked at the 3 men for a moment before she spoke. She said, "They only look poor because of where they've been." Then she got in the truck and drove them home, and Del told the story at the feed store that same week, and by the account he gave, it was the funniest thing that had happened in the valley all year. She turned the geese out onto the bottoms the day she brought them home, and the change in them over the following weeks was the first thing that made anybody stop laughing, though almost nobody saw it happen. Freed onto that wet, wild, cold ground that ruined everything else, the birds spread out across the low pasture and ate and ate and ate, and the marshy abundance that no other creature would touch went into them and came back out as flesh and feather. Within a month, the molted patches had filled in. Within 2, the footsore limping was gone, worn away by soft, wet earth instead of wire. By midsummer, the 200 scrawny geese Del Marchetti had laughed at were 200 broad, heavy, glossy birds that moved across the bottoms in a slow white tide, and Wren stood at the edge of the willows in the evenings and watched them and wrote in her notebook and said very little to anyone, because there was no one to say it to. She lost 11 birds that first summer to a fox and to the ordinary hazards of animals living outdoors, and she wrote each loss down and studied the pattern of it and moved her fencing accordingly, and she did not lose any more that way. She was learning the birds the same way she had learned the ground, by watching, by waiting, by writing it down. The first money came in the fall, and it came small, the way real things start. Wren had raised the geese for 2 purposes she had settled on early, meat and down, and she had timed a first small harvest for autumn, culling the drakes she did not need for breeding, and she did the plucking and the dressing herself in the cold barn with hands that blistered and then hardened, and she took a dozen dressed geese to the only butcher in the county seat, a heavy-set patient man named Silas Rooney, who ran a shop that his father had run before him. Silas looked at her geese a long time, the way she looked at things, and he turned one over in his big hands and felt the breast and smelled it, and finally said he would take all 12 on consignment and see how they moved, which was his careful way of saying he did not expect them to move at all. Then he sold every one of them in 4 days, and 2 of the customers came back asking when he would have more, and one of those customers was the wife of a man who owned a restaurant 2 counties over. And that was the thread that, pulled slowly, unraveled the whole valley's certainty about what Wren Callahan's geese were worth. Because the geese did not taste like the geese people remembered, which had been raised on grain in a shed and had come out greasy and strong. These had grown up eating wild marsh grass and sedge, and the pond's clean water, and the meat was dark and clean and rich in a way that a chef, when he finally got his hands on one, through that restaurant owner's wife, described as tasting like the land it came from, which he meant as the highest compliment he knew. His name was Marco Devine, and he had left a city kitchen to open a small place called the Larkspur out on the state road, cooking food from within 50 miles of his own door, and he had spent 2 frustrated years unable to find a goose worth putting on a plate. When he tasted Wren's, he drove out to Harlow Bottoms himself, all the way to the dead end of the road, and he stood at the fence in his city shoes and watched the white tide move across the wet ground, and he understood, the way Wren had understood, that he was looking at something. He ordered 40 geese for the fall. He paid a price that made Wren go quiet and check her arithmetic twice. And he told every chef he knew. Word of the geese moved the way word moves in country like that, not through advertising, of which Wren did none, but through the slow, reliable machinery of people telling other people. Silas Rooney told his customers. His customers told their families. The gas station at the county highway crossing, run by a sharp-eyed woman named Verna Pruitt, who knew everything that happened in 3 counties before the people it happened to did, became the unofficial clearinghouse for the story of the Callahan geese, and Verna, who had at first repeated Del Marchetti's version with relish, began instead to tell a different version, the one where the scrawny birds had come good, and the girl at the end of Harlow Bottoms was selling everything she could raise to a fancy restaurant on the state road. People began driving out just to look. Wren, who did not particularly want to be looked at, put up a hand-lettered sign at the head of the road that said eggs and geese in season, and left it at that, and let the demand come to her instead of chasing it, which was the only way she knew how to do anything. Del Marchetti heard all of it, of course, at the feed store and at the gas station and from his own wife, and for a good long while he held his position, because a man who has laughed at something publicly has a stake in being right about it. He allowed that the girl had gotten lucky. He said grazing geese were a curiosity, and a curiosity was not a living, and that the whole thing would collapse the first bad winter. And he offered this, as he offered everything, as a fact laid out for consideration rather than an argument to be won. "This isn't going anywhere," he said, one afternoon at the feed store, loud enough for the room. "You cannot build anything on a novelty and a soft-hearted cook. Grass geese on ruined bottom ground. It leads nowhere." There were men in that room who nodded, because it was the sensible thing to say, and it was the kind of thing that had always been true before, and Del Marchetti was not a cruel man, only a conventional one, which in that valley was a far more common and far more stubborn condition. He believed what everyone he respected believed. He believed the bottoms were worthless because everyone had always known the bottoms were worthless, and he was about to spend a great deal of money proving himself wrong without ever meaning to. The second full year was the year the story turned from a curiosity into something the whole county would remember, and it turned on the weather, which was the one subject Ambrose Teague had understood better than any man alive and had never once been thanked for. That spring came warm and early, and every farmer in the valley, Del Marchetti foremost among them, read the warmth as a gift and planted early to get a jump on the season, putting corn and beans and truck garden crops in the ground weeks ahead of the old safe dates. Wren watched them do it from the end of Harlow Bottoms Road and said nothing, because it was not her business, and because she had learned that nobody in that valley wanted weather advice from a 24-year-old woman who kept geese. But she had read the ledgers. She had read 50 years of Ambrose's rainfall and frost notes, and she knew, the way she knew few things, that a warm, early spring in that valley was not a gift, but a trap. That it was exactly the kind of spring that had, 4 separate times in Ambrose's records, ended in a killing frost in the second week of a month when frost was supposed to be long gone. She wrote in her notebook that spring, on a page dated in her own careful hand, that the valley was planting into a warm lie, and she moved her breeding geese onto the very lowest ground she had, down where the pond water kept the air a shade gentler, and she did it for no reason she could have defended to anyone except that 50 years of a dead man's watching told her to. Then she waited, the way she waited for everything, and the valley went on being warm and green and confident, and the corn came up in Del Marchetti's 400 acres in neat green rows, and the truck farmers who supplied the county markets set out their tender starts, and for 3 weeks everything anybody had gambled looked like it was going to pay. The frost came on a Tuesday night in a month it had no business coming, and it came the way killing frosts always come in that country, silent and clear and calm, the sky washing out to a hard black, and the temperature falling through the safe numbers while the valley slept. Wren was awake for it. She had read the sky at dusk, the way Ambrose had taught the ledgers to teach her. The still air and the cloudless cold, and the particular smell the ground gave off, and she had gone out at 2 in the morning in her great-uncle's old coat and walked the fence line of the bottoms with a flashlight, and she had watched the frost come down over the high ground first, silvering the grass on the ridge and the slopes, sliding down toward the low pasture, and then, near the edge of the wet bottoms where the pond breathed its faint warmth into the air, thinning, hesitating, stopping. She stood at that line in the dark, the frost bright and total on the ground behind her, and the bottoms dark and unfrozen in front of her, and she understood that she was standing in the exact place her great-uncle had tried for 40 years to make the valley see, the line where the cold gave up, the line that skipped the low ground by a week every year, and she felt him there so strongly that she said his name aloud to the dark, and then felt foolish, and then did not feel foolish at all. By morning the valley knew. The killing frost had taken everything on the high ground, and the ordinary fields had blackened Del Marchetti's young corn across all 400 acres, had killed the truck farmers' tender starts down to the root, had wiped out in a single silent night the early gamble that a whole valley of confident men had made on a warm and lying spring. The county seat was full of stunned faces that week, and the feed store was quiet in the particular way a place gets quiet when everyone in it has lost money at the same time. And down at the dead end of Harlow Bottoms Road, on the low ground that the cold had skipped, Wren Callahan's geese moved across a pasture that was still green, and her breeding flock had come through the frost untouched, and the wild marsh grass that fed them had never so much as felt the cold. She did not gloat. There was no one to gloat to, and it was not in her to do it anyway. But Verna Pruitt, at the gas station on the highway, told everyone who came in for coffee and diesel that the only green field left in the whole valley was the one full of the geese people had laughed at, and she told it not as gossip now, but as something closer to a parable, and the men who heard it did not laugh. It was Del Marchetti who came out to the farm in the end, and he came alone, which was the important part. He drove down Harlow Bottoms Road in the middle of a gray afternoon, a week after the frost, and he pulled up at the fence where the geese were grazing the green bottoms, and he sat in his truck for a while before he got out, the way a man does when he is arranging in his head something that is hard to say. Wren watched him come from the barn, and she walked out to the fence and stood on her side of it and waited, because she had learned that waiting made other people fill the silence, and Del filled it. He said the frost had taken all 400 acres. He said he had farmed that ground for 30 years, and his father before him, and neither of them had ever lost a whole crop to a frost that late. He looked out over the green bottoms and the fat white geese, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Your uncle told me once. He said it flat, like it hurt. He said Ambrose had come up to him at a cattle sale maybe 15 years back and told him the bottoms froze last, that the cold skipped the low ground, that he ought to think about what could be grown down there late, and that he, Dell, had told the old man he was a fool with 50 years of talking to himself and had walked away and told the story to his friends. He said he had laughed at Ambrose Teague the same way he had laughed at her. Then he said he was right, and he did not make a large production of it, did not apologize in so many words, because men like Dell do not. But he took his hat off standing at that fence, which Wren understood, and she understood too that it was the most he had ever done for anyone. He asked her before he left whether she thought geese could be run on his wet corner down by the Sable Fork, the low 40 that flooded every year, and that he had cursed his whole life. And she looked at him a long moment and then said she thought they could, and that she would help him figure it if he wanted. And that was how the thing that had been one girl's stubbornness at the dead end of a road became, over the next few years, something that changed the shape of farming in that valley. Because Del Marchetti was a respected man, and when a respected man stands at a fence with his hat off and admits he was wrong about the ground, other men listen in a way they never would have listened to a 24-year-old woman with a hand-lettered sign. And one by one the farmers with wet, useless bottoms and cold-skipped low ground came to Wren Callahan to ask how it was done. And she told them, and she did not charge them for the telling, and she did not try to keep the knowledge for herself, because Odessa had taught her without ever saying so directly that knowledge kept is knowledge that dies with you, the way Ambrose's had nearly died with him. The geese carried the whole enterprise, and they carried it the only way Wren would let it be carried, which was slowly, on their own legs, without debt. Marco Devine at the Larkspur took all she could raise and told every chef within 100 miles, and the down, which she had learned to hand-pluck and clean, and which was finer than anything the geese and sheds ever produced, found its way to a woman who made quilts and pillows over in the next county and who paid for clean grazed goose down prices that startled Wren all over again. She kept a notebook for the down, and a notebook for the meat, and a notebook for the eggs, and a notebook for the weather. 4 of them going at once now, all in Ambrose's tradition, all written in the same careful hand. And she never once took out a loan, never once bought a piece of ground or a bird. She could not pay for that day, and when people asked her why she did not expand faster, why she did not borrow against the demand, and double the flock, and buy the least bottoms outright and become, as she easily could have, the largest goose operation in that whole part of the state, she gave them the answer she gave everything, which was that she would grow the way the geese grew, on grass, on time, on ground that owed nobody anything. Let the demand pull it, she said. Don't push it with money you don't have. She grew from 200 birds to 500 over 3 years, and from 500 to a little over 1,000 over 3 more, and every bird of it was paid for out of the birds that came before, and the whole thing stood on its own feet the entire way, the way she meant it to, the way a thing has to stand if it is going to last past the person who built it. Odessa lived to see most of it, which mattered to Wren more than the money did. The old woman would come down the road in her canvas coveralls and her rubber boots and stand at the fence and watch the geese and say almost nothing. And once, in the 4th year, when the operation had grown to the point that Wren had hired a quiet teenage boy named Toby Renfrew from up the highway to help with the fencing and the plucking, Odessa watched the 2 of them work for a while and then said, apropos of nothing, that Ambrose would have hated all the fuss and loved the geese, and that this was about the best a person could hope to leave behind, a thing that was more right than they were. Then she went home. She died the following winter, in her sleep, in her own bed, 85 years old, and Wren found her because Odessa had not come down to the fence for 2 days, and she sat with her a while before she called anyone, and then she went out to the bottoms in the cold and stood at the frost line in the dark the way she had the night of the killin' frost, and she said both their names to the dark that time, Ambrose and Odessa, the 2 people who had seen the worth in things the valley threw away. and she understood that she was the last one left who carried what they had carried, and that she had better write it down. So she did. She spent that whole grieving winter organizing the ledgers, hers and Ambrose's both, decades of rainfall and frost dates and flood depths, and the slow accumulated knowledge of what would grow on cold-skipped low ground and what would not. And she wrote out in plain language the thing Ambrose had underlined twice in a ledger before she was born. The frost that kills the valley skips the low ground by a week, and she made copies of it, and she gave them to the farmers who asked, and to the county extension office that had ignored her great-uncle his whole life, and to Toby Renfrew, who by then had decided he wanted to run geese himself someday on his own family's wet ground. She was not trying to build a monument. She was doing what her people had done, which was to watch a place carefully and write down the truth of it and hand that truth to whoever came next. And if the valley had spent 2 generations calling that habit the mark of a simple man who talked to his cattle, the valley was beginning, slowly, in the way that valley did everything, to call it something else. Marco Devine put the geese on his menu by name, Callahan Bottom's goose, and people drove from the city to eat it. And the larkspur grew from a small place on the state road into a place you had to know about. And Marco always told the story to anyone who asked, the story of the girl at the dead end of Harlow Bottoms Road who had bought 200 scrawny geese that everyone laughed at and turned worthless ground into the finest thing on his plate. Silas Rooney at the butcher shop kept a waiting list. Verna Pruitt at the gas station kept the legend polished, and Del Marchetti, who had run geese on his Sable Fork bottoms for 6 years by then and made better money off that low 40 than off any 100 acres of his corn, told the story too, told it against himself, told the part where he laughed and the part where he stood at the fence with his hat off, and he told it. People noticed, with a kind of pride, as though having been that wrong and having admitted it was its own sort of accomplishment, which perhaps it was. There came a fall in the 7th year, when Wren Callahan stood at the head of Harlow Bottoms Road on a gray morning and watched a stock trailer being loaded, and the symmetry of it was not lost on her. It was Toby Renfrew's trailer this time, and the geese going into it were 200 birds Wren was selling him to start his own flock on his family's wet ground up the highway. And they were fine geese, broad and glossy and fat off the grass, nothing scrawny about them. And Toby was loading them without hurrying, the way she had taught him, taking each bird by the base of the wings, setting it down, reaching for the next, keeping the tally in his head and in a notebook in his jacket pocket. There were men at the fence watching, the way there were always men at a fence in that valley, but they were not laughing now. They had driven out to see it, to see the girl who had been proved right sell the start of a flock to the boy who would carry it on. And one of them, an old-timer, who had nodded along with Del Marchetti at the feed store 7 years before, said quietly to another that he wished he had bought bottom ground when it was cheap, and the other man said everybody wished that now. Wren watched Toby count the birds into the trailer, 60, 61, 62, and she thought about the day she had counted 200 scrawny geese into a borrowed trailer, while Del Marchetti told her a scrawny goose ate the same as a fat one. And she thought about Ambrose dead in the pasture, with a fence tool in his hand and Odessa shelling beans on her porch and saying, "Worth isn't loud. It just waits for the right cold." And she thought that the whole 7 years had been that one sentence proving itself out across the calendar, slowly, without anybody having to argue it, the ground itself and the weather itself and the geese themselves settling the question that no amount of talking ever could have. She had never once tried to convince Del Marchetti of anything. She had let the frost do it. She had let the birds do it. She had let the demand pull the growth and the results speak for the worth, and she had refused the whole way to build the thing any faster or any bigger than it could build itself. And it had made her, if not rich, then something better than rich in that country, which was respected on her own terms and rooted in her own ground. Toby latched the trailer gate and came over to the fence, and he asked her, a little nervous, whether she thought geese would come good on his family's bottoms the way they had on hers. And Wren looked out at the low green pasture where 1,000 white birds moved in the gray morning light, and she was quiet a moment, the way she was always quiet before she said a thing worth saying. She told him the ground would do the work if he let it, that his job was to watch and to wait and to write it down, that the birds would look poor for a while because of where they had been, and then they would come good because of where they were, and that the only thing that could ruin it was hurrying. Worth isn't loud, she said, and she heard Odessa in her own voice and did not mind. It just waits for the right cold. Toby wrote it down in his notebook, and Wren watched him do it and felt the line go on past her the way it had come to her. And she thought that was about the best a person could hope to leave behind, and she knew whose words those were too. He drove the geese up the highway, and the men at the fence drifted off to their trucks, and Wren stood alone at the head of Harlow Bottoms Road for a while afterward, looking down the 3 miles of lane that gave up at the dead end, at the suede barn, and the re-roofed house and the willows and the pond that never went dry, at the low, cold, worthless bottoms that had turned out to be the only ground in the valley that could not be killed by the thing that killed everything else. She had come here 7 years before, with everything she owned in the bed of a truck that burned oil, not because she had a plan, but because she had felt something for the place that nobody else in her family had ever felt, and it turned out that feeling had been the plan, that the thing which made her come was the same thing which made her look at scrawny geese and worthless ground, and a dead man's ledgers long enough to see what was in them. She thought that the valley had been half right about Ambrose all along. He had talked to his cattle. He had lived alone at the end of a road, but he had also seen the truth of a place across 50 patient years, and written it down for whoever came after. And if that was what it meant to be simple, then she hoped to be simple too, and to leave the ledgers fuller than she found them, and to hand the whole watching, waiting, written down business on to the next quiet person who felt something for ground that everyone else had given up on. The frost came again that fall, on schedule. In the second week of the month it always came, and it silvered the ridge and slid down over the high ground and killed the last of the season across the valley. And it stopped, as it always stopped, at the edge of the low bottoms where the pond breathed its warmth into the dark, and the geese grazed on through it, and Wren Callahan stood at that line one more time in her great-uncle's old coat and watched the cold give up at the place he had told a whole valley it would give up, 40 years before anyone believed him. She did not need to be there to know it would happen. She went because it was the closest thing she had to visiting the two people who had taught her to see, standing at the line where the worth of the whole place proved itself every single year, quietly, in the dark, without anybody watching. And the frost stopped, and the green held, and she stood in it a while, and then she went home. If this story found you at a moment when somebody has looked at what you're holding and told you it isn't worth much, I hope you'll carry it to a person who needs to hear it, because there is always someone in your life standing at the head of their own dead-end road with 200 scrawny geese and a head full of doubt, and they might need to know that worth doesn't announce itself. It just waits for the right cold. Leave me a comment and tell me about the thing you were told to give up on, whether you gave it up or held on, because I truly want to know, and I read every single one. Tell me the town and the country you're watching from so I can see how far these stories travel, and if the frost has ever skipped your low ground when it killed everyone else's. If patience ever proved out where nobody thought it could, say so below, and I promise you I will be there in the comments to read it.